Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. 1,000 songs in your pocket. That's what Steve Jobs famously said at an Apple event back in 2001. He went on to hold out a white device the size of a deck of cards that could store and play an entire music library without a hitch. It was unthinkable at the time, as 20 or 30 songs was the norm for a flash MP3 player. But 1,000 songs is what Apple promised and delivered in the form of the iPod. Many of you watching have owned an iPod in one form or another, and probably have fond memories of it. But last year, Apple discontinued the iconic product that brought the company back from the brink of collapse. The original iPod was a pioneer in terms of a simple design and easy-to-use functionality. But did you know that the iPod was designed and manufactured in just a few months? And also, in a strange legal case, Apple credited the idea of the iPod to an obscure man by the name of Ken Kramer. In this episode, we'll look at all of that and how the original iPod was so critical for Apple and the music industry.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
This is a total solution. You have an iPod, Firewire, iTunes with all your music in it, and it all works together seamlessly. And only Apple can do that because we make the hardware, the software, and all the technology that allows us to solve problems for people that no one else would dare take on.
The story of the making of the first iPod started with seemingly unrelated incidents. As you'll see, a string of events and technological innovations would fall exactly in the right places to make it happen. It all started in the late 1990s. After 11 years in exile, Steve Jobs would return to Apple in 1997. The company was going through a financial crisis, and Jobs was brought back in hopes that he'll be able to steer the company in the right direction. Apple also needed some fresh ideas to make a mark at the turning of the 20th century. It was the dawn of the internet, and the whole world was going digital, so upon his return, to keep up with modern times, Steve Jobs adopted a digital hub strategy. The idea was to combine Apple hardware, software, and services so that users could have a uniform platform for their digital lifestyle. In a nutshell, an ecosystem where everything works seamlessly. And as you all know very well, Apple's ecosystem became an integral part of the company's future. But as for now, the idea was in its infancy. The focal point of this digital hub was the iMac. But interestingly, Steve Jobs would realize the untapped potential of the Firewire port. This standard digital data bus was developed by Apple in the late 1980s and was used for many years by Apple themselves and other companies like Sony. Firewire could connect devices like camcorders and digital cameras to computers. Its main benefit was the speed. It could transfer data at a significantly faster rate, almost 30 times faster than any other standard at the time. This rate was 400 megabits per second. Laughable now, but at that time it was a big deal. Steve Jobs decided to include Firewire in the iconic translucent iMac G3, which was released in 1998. Apple thought that the inclusion of Firewire would allow users to easily transfer videos shot with their digital camcorders and edit them on their computers. But as it turned out, people were much more interested in music. In the 90s, the internet was taking over the world. People were increasingly sharing files and information online, but sharing music files was still difficult in the early 90s, as internet speeds were ridiculously slow. Music was typically ripped from CDs, and file sizes were huge. But some researchers at the Fraunhofer Institute in Munich, Germany, had some ideas. After 4 years of difficult work, they created a brand new file format. And of course, you've heard of it. It's called MP3. It significantly reduced the size of music files, without compromising on audio quality. The rise of the MP3 file format caused a lot of commotion in the music industry. First of all, it became very easy for everyone to rip their CDs into MP3 files and store them on their computers. The time was just right for a little device to come along and allow people to take these files with them on the go. By 1998, MP3 players like the MP-Man F100 from Elgar Labs and the Diamond Rio PMP3 300 had hit the market. Both were bulky, could barely play 30 minutes of music, and cost more than $200. But they became popular as people just loved portable music. And then the floodgates would open. Peer-to-peer file sharing sites would allow people to download music for free. One application, Napster, became an overnight sensation, It became so popular that it got into legal disputes with one of the biggest heavy metal bands, Metallica. Overall, the entire music industry took a big hit, and record labels were losing millions in revenue. Everybody recognized, though, that the future of music distribution was in digital format. It's quite interesting to think about how one innovation can snowball into another and cause a major disruption in the process. Meanwhile, during the growing frenzy of digital music, Apple saw a huge gap in its digital hub strategy. To fill that void, Apple bought SoundJam MP. It was a popular MP3 encoding and playback application. 3 of its engineers were also brought to Apple. They would transform SoundJam into iTunes. Jobs wanted iTunes to seamlessly transfer music files from computers to MP3 players. However, while investigating this, the Apple team found the vast majority of players to be useless. They were either too expensive, too bulky, too small, or too clunky to use. And transferring music files from computers was painfully slow. This was a crucial moment when Steve Jobs saw an opportunity. As an avid music fan himself, he planned to create a small portable MP3 player that could store hundreds of songs and play CD-quality music. He wanted the player to work well with iTunes to potentially attract more customers to the Mac platform. At the end of 2000, Jobs had assigned John Rubinstein to the task. Rubinstein joined Apple in 1997. He was the company's hardware engineering chief and Steve Jobs' most trusted hardware advisor. He recognized that Apple already had most of the components needed to make an MP3 player. The FireWire port could solve the transfer speed problem. Other parts could be sourced from in-house hardware departments or outside suppliers. There was only one problem. Flash storage was too expensive, so a hard drive was the only option. How were they going to find a hard drive that was small enough but also had a high enough capacity? As luck would have it, in February of 2001, Rubinstein found such a device, a hard drive with a 5GB capacity. He just happened to be visiting Toshiba in Japan when he found it. The Toshiba engineers didn't know what they could use it for, but this was a game changer for Rubinstein. Now a player could be made with a small form factor and high capacity. He immediately purchased the rights for $10 million, after getting permission from Steve Jobs, of course. A lot of people don't know this, but a couple of years earlier in 1999, the computer company Compaq had the same idea as Apple, but they used a laptop hard drive. It did provide 4.8GB of capacity storage, but at $799, it wasn't cheap, and it ended up being very bulky. Rubinstein would hire Tony Fadell to work further on this project. Fadell had previously worked for General Magic and Philips Electronics, and hence, he had plenty of experience developing handheld devices such as PDAs and palm tops. When Fadell came to Apple in February of 2001, he was given only 6 weeks to present a prototype. It was such a difficult situation for him because there was no research, no previous design, or not even a team to help him out. However, he stuck with it and managed to develop 3 concepts on his own. In mid-April 2001, he presented his prototypes to Apple executives, including Steve Jobs. During that same meeting, Apple's head of product marketing, Phil Schiller, suggested the iconic design of a mechanical scroll wheel. It wasn't a novel concept, as he drew his inspiration from other devices, such as the Bang & Olufsen Buellcom phone. But Schiller correctly believed that users could scroll through hundreds of songs much faster with the wheel than the methods of the other MP3 players, such as up and down buttons. And he was right. Anyone who watched anyone else use an MP3 player in the early 2000s would remember just how tedious it was to get through a song list. With the basic concept in place, Fadell was given a full-time job at Apple. He only had 6 months, from the end of April to October. Within that time, he had to form a team, develop a product, get it manufactured, and push it out the door. Apple engineers were tied down with Mac projects, so Fadell had to assemble a team of 25 regulars and contractors from the outside. Some came from his startup company, Fuse, and a few veteran engineers joined from General Magic and Philips. Due to time constraints, Fadell's team had to adopt a collaborative approach. A Silicon Valley startup, Portal Player, provided the specialized MP3 playing chipset. A Cupertino company named Pixo supplied the basic OS. Jeff Robin and interface designer Tim Wasco transformed the OS into a high-level user interface and music playing software. In-house expertise helped with the power supply and display, and Apple already had that 5GB Toshiba disk, a battery from Sony, and FireWire. To meet the deadline, all team members were required to work 18 to 20 hours per day, 7 days a week. As you can imagine, it cost them dearly in their personal lives. According to Fidel, it was so tough that he had to break up with his girlfriend at the time. Meanwhile, Apple's design team, led by Jonathan Ive, would work on the design process. Jobs insisted on not doing too much with the product. He wanted the device to be functional but simple, but also as small as humanly possible. Johnny Ive's team settled on a modest box the size of a deck of cards, and this was after creating a dozen prototypes. They used white polycarbonate on the front of the device and stainless steel on the back. It was a minimalist form, reminiscent of the Braun T3 pocket radio, the brainchild of Dieter Rams, a German industrial designer. Johnny Ive had always admired Rams for his sleek and modular design aesthetic. The name iPod was suggested by a freelance copywriter, Vinny Chico from San Francisco. Jobs frequently mentioned Apple's digital hub concept while discussing the player. The Mac was the hub for the host of other gadgets, and Chico compared the hub to a spaceship, while other smaller vessels, as in pods, would come in and out to feed off it. When he saw a prototype, the white design struck a chord with him. He came up with the word pod by drawing inspiration from the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. The prefix I was added to match with the iMac. After 6 months of painstakingly hard work, the device was finally ready. On October 23, 2001, Steve Jobs revealed the iPod to the world. Despite its $399 price tag, people loved the device, and it quickly became a status symbol for coolness. With a 1,000 song capacity, it was a leap forward for MP3 players. But contrary to popular belief, it wasn't an immediate smash hit. Steve Jobs was adamant that the iPod should only be available for Mac. He thought the product was so compelling that people would jump ship and dive right into the Apple ecosystem. But what it ended up doing was alienating a huge market. Apple management eventually convinced Jobs that it should be available on Windows as well. And from this moment, the iPod really took off. The iPod would pave the way for Apple's future dominance in the music industry. Apple launched the iTunes Store, and now users could buy individual tracks for 99 cents instead of purchasing an entire album. iTunes would go on to dominate 70% of the legal download market at its peak in 2007. Despite the figures, it was insignificant for Apple because iTunes served only as a driver to its main cash cow, the iPod. The iPod single-handedly turned the Apple company around. Selling over 100 iPods a minute, it fixed their financial situation and also made the company cool again from the floundering company it was in the 1990s. Okay, so what about that Kane Kramer guy, the guy who Apple credited as inventing the iPod? Well, I have done a full episode on it, but essentially, Apple was in a lawsuit with Burst.com. During the proceedings, Apple produced some documentation that labelled Kane Kramer the father of the iPod, due to his invention of the concept of the MP3 player and a store analogous to iTunes all the way back in 1979. I'll leave a full link to that episode down below. So in conclusion, Apple sold more than 400 million iPods before discontinuing the brand last year. The iPod Mini, Shuffle, Nano, and Touch came in all different shapes, colours, sizes, and had different features. But every generation of iPod shared the same ethos, simplicity and functionality. The iPod did give Apple the means to create the iPhone, which eventually would become Apple's greatest selling product. However, the iPod's legacy will live on. So for me personally, I do find the story of the iPod quite interesting. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments section below. Anyways, that's about it from me. My name is Dagogo, and you have been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll catch you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one. My PS elusive as it's close to me. She's been feeling further than a memory. Just want to go back to how it used to be. Used to be.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.